Hello. This is our third discussion of passages within the Scripture that relate to how the Spirit of God is active in our midst. We are picking up this theme because we are now going through the entire season of Pentecost, and so far we've considered the way in which the Spirit of God gives us insight into action and insight into ethics. And just as we saw that the insight of action leads to the insight of ethics, so now the insight of ethics, which we considered last week, leads into our present topic, namely the insight of faith, the insight into how it is that we understand the very presence and reality of God. Because one of the principal themes of the Holy Scriptures, of both the Scriptures of Israel and the New Testament, is that faith is something that is discovered by means of the Spirit of God. It is not simply a static set of beliefs, it's rather a relationship to God in which God consistently informs us. We're going to consider a period of time among the prophets of Israel and also the priests of Israel when their insight of faith led them to develop what was truly a religious revolution. Not just a revolution for Israel and later on for Christianity, but a revolution among the different kinds of religion that were in the world at that time. And I would argue that this prophetic revolution also is something that continues to be worked out today. The initial entry in today's handout, which will also be available on the web, clearly states what is happening during this period of Israel's development. It is the same period that the prophet Jeremiah addressed last week. You remember that when Jeremiah told the people who had been exiled into Babylon to seek the peace of the city in which they were dwelling, he insisted on Yahweh's behalf that it was Yahweh's decision to send them into exile. That is, Yahweh's action extended from his normal territory, the land of promise, all the way into Babylon. And the fact of Israel being exiled did not mean that their contact with Yahweh had been broken. Yahweh was not just for one place or one time. He could make himself available in any place and in any time. When you think of God in that way, that leads to the insight that God needs to be understood as a unity. God needs to be understood as being one. This period in the history of Israel, this is the 6th century before the Common Era, just after the destruction of the temple in the year 586 BCE, is when monotheism made its appearance among the religions of the world. Now, it's easy for us to conceive, because Israel came to believe that there was only one God, that Israelites always believed that there was only one God. But in fact, we know from the very scriptures that was not the case. That in the earliest moments of Israel's existence, they knew very well that there were gods of Egypt, there were gods in the land to which they came from Egypt, the land of Canaan, with their own particular forms of worship. Gods, of course, among the Assyrians, gods among the Babylonians. Israel was very clear that for Israel, only Yahweh could be loyally served. Yahweh had a particular relationship with the people of Israel, but there was a common understanding that the world was populated by different gods, just as it was populated by differing cultures. But if you think that Yahweh is with you, not only when you're in the land of promise, but also when you're in the land of Babylon, that implies that Yahweh is not in any way constrained by space. And so we get this remarkable assertion in a part of the book of Isaiah which was written during this period. Isaiah 44:6. So says Yahweh, the King of Israel and their Redeemer, Yahweh of armies. I am the first and I am the last. Besides me, there is no God. There is in the universe precisely one God. This becomes a basic prophetic assertion repeated many times in this section of the book of Isaiah, precisely because it's an innovative statement. It's something new, a fresh insight of God's Spirit. It's so central to the understanding of who God is that, of course, this statement is then taken up in the Quran and is a basic assertion of Islam as it is of Judaism and Christianity. I said that it's repeated many times, and the very next passage on your sheet from Isaiah 45, verses 5 through 7, gives an example of that. It is a repetition of this assertion of monotheism, but what it is particularly striking is that this statement of Yahweh is directed not to Israel, but instead to Cyrus the Persian. Cyrus was the leader of the Persian Empire who ultimately ended the exile of Israel. He permitted the people of Judea to return to their land, to Jerusalem, and ultimately also to rebuild their temple. The author of this portion of the book of Isaiah sees this as an example of how it is that God can act through people in quite different cultures, including people who, because of their particular background, don't even know Yahweh. Yahweh is bigger than our conception and larger than any single culture. And so he says to Cyrus in the passage from Isaiah 45, 5 through 7, I am Yahweh, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I strengthen you, though you do not know me. This was how the author of this part of Isaiah understood what was going on in the case of Cyrus, because his action was unusual. When he had taken over the Babylonian Empire, he had inherited people who had been exiled from various nations, not only Israel. And he made the decision that they could all return to their native lands. They could all rebuild their temples. It was a remarkable ancient experiment in toleration. And in the mind of the prophet of this section of Isaiah, that meant that Cyrus had been inspired to act by the Spirit of God. I strengthen you, though you do not know me, so that they may know, that is, all people may know, from the rising of the sun and from the west, that there is nothing besides me. I am Yahweh, there is no other. I form light and create darkness. I make peace and create bad. I, Yahweh, do all these things. The fact that God can act beyond boundaries means, the prophet says by his insight, that there are no boundaries to knowing God, that God can take up people outside of Israel as his agents and use them for his purposes, so that people as a whole might come to know the reality of Yahweh. This is one of the basic insights of monotheism. Another is that when you assert that there is one God, that means also that that God acts not only when things are going well, but also when things are difficult. Trying circumstances, such as the circumstance of exile, are there for a purpose, are there so that the design of God can be worked out. In this case, it is one way by which Judaism actually did become an international religion from this period, as an inadvertent consequence of their exile to Babylonia. It brought about a time when the mixture of cultures actually encouraged the development of monotheism. Because just as the prophet of Isaiah sees that God acts not only within Israel, so also people in the ancient world of a more philosophical bent of mind came to be impatient with the idea of there being a multiplicity of gods. It seemed to them that if you wanted to think consistently about our reality, you should be searching for a single creator. And Judaism became extremely well regarded in the ancient world because of its single devotion to the one God. And this one God is understood as operating different times, different places, different cultures, and equally important as creator. Because God creates, because there is light and darkness in creation, because in the life of the world there is peace and there's also difficulty, God is seen as behind all that, and God is celebrated in all that. It is precisely because of this celebration that I refer to today's title as The Insight of Faith Among Prophets and Priests. Because, very interestingly, priests were also taken up in the monotheist revolution during this same period. One of the other positive effects of the exile was that it brought about a situation in which prophets and priests who had over time largely been in contention, largely represented different interests, actually came together. During the earlier period, the insistence of the prophets upon ethics had led them to a denunciation of the wealthiest people in Israel, who the priests tended to be aligned with. The result of that was you saw a controversy between prophets and priests in the time before the exile. But in the exile, prophets and priests were both in the same Babylonian boat. They both were looking for redemption. And they also saw that, in fact, they indeed were talking about the same God, Yahweh, that Yahweh was one, and that Yahweh was single, the only God of the universe. The cooperation between prophets and priests was so great that it actually resulted in the first written version of what we would call the Bible. If we were able to go back to the 6th century before the Common Era, we would see developing during that time the two oldest components of the Hebrew Bible, namely the books of the prophets, whom we've been considering so far, and also the work called the Torah, or the law. That is, the specification of what it is that Israel is to do in order to inherit the promise given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These two great components came together precisely because in the crisis of exile, it was desperately important for Israel to remember in words what they had largely lost on the ground because Judea, Jerusalem, and the temple had been destroyed. So this great coalescence between priests and prophets leads also to their common embrace of this new revolutionary monotheism. And they did not leave the people of Israel behind in the insight of monotheism. We can see this clearly worked out in many cases within the oldest parts of the book of Psalms, because the book of Psalms was also coming together during this period, not as a whole, but many of the Psalms that exist in the present book were certainly used during this period, and indeed some of them were used at an earlier period. In this particular case, we can see especially how it is that Israelites as a whole, not only the religious experts were the priests, not only the innovative thinkers who were the prophets, but also Israelites in their generality were taken up into this insight of a monotheistic faith. And I have given the example of Psalm 104, verses 27 through 30, which is itself a celebration of the way in which God works in the creation, such that if a person is attuned to nature, that person can also understand Yahweh. And so the psalmist teaches people to sing, and it's important to realize, for the most part, the psalms were sung, and they're sung by people from memory in association with their worship. All creatures look to you to give them their food in season. You give to them, they glean. You open your hand, they are filled with good. You cover your face, they despair. When you take away their spirit, they perish and return to their dust. You send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. As people sang these words, there were several truths brought home to them. One was, just as in human life, there are moments filled with peace and moments of huge difficulty, so is the life of the universe. So is the natural world. Creatures as a whole, because they were made by God, take part in the influence and the works of God's Spirit. One can look to nature and in that understand something of the way in which God works by means of divine spirit. This aspect of the insight of faith, which is very closely associated with monotheism, is an awareness that, from my own point of view, we can continue to learn from. There has been a tendency, in recent years especially, to think of a high regard for nature as being incompatible with monotheism, as being too close to a form of religion called animism, in which the basic idea is that the universe that surrounds you is alive. But in my view, there is no actual contradiction between monotheism and animism in this regard. The psalmist knows very carefully, as he says, when you take away their spirit, they perish and return to the dust. In other words, there is spirit in the life of creation, a spirit derived from God. The term spirit itself in Hebrew, ruach, means wind, and it's used in order to speak of the influence of God upon us, because wind is one of those forces which, when you experience it, you can't say where exactly it comes from or where it is going. Jesus said precisely that. But you do know that it is a force. And in this psalm, the psalmist is insisting that God's Spirit gives spirit to all the entities that are alive. We live in a reality that is actually framed by spirit. It's interesting, by the way, that because the term spirit basically means wind, in some translations of this psalm, instead of saying, when you take away their spirit, they say, when you take away their breath. That's not a wrong translation, but the term actually used in the Hebrew is ruach, and it's used again when the psalmist says, you send forth your spirit, they are created. The point of the psalm in Hebrew is that God's spirit, which creates, is directly related to our spirits, which are created. Another insight of faith is that we can know God because God constantly influences us. And this understanding that you can see clearly in Psalm 104, and incidentally in many, many other psalms of this same period, is taken up in a text which is very well known to all of us, but which also has a line of meaning which is often overlooked. And here I refer to the book of Genesis, where this same conception of spirit as wind is taken up. In fact, when we come to the term spirit, some translations will say wind instead of spirit. Genesis 1:1 through 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless, void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. But God's Spirit hovered over the face of the waters. The picture here is God's Spirit hovering in the same way that a bird hovers. When a bird, a large bird, say an eagle, is over the Hudson River, as it swoops down, the movement of its wings will actually make a pattern on the waters. So the picture of Genesis is that God's invisible spirit had this impact of making form of what was formless, of pushing the primeval waters to create the possibility of life. And Genesis 1 as a whole, if you read through the chapter, is a strong assertion of the way in which God's creation should be understood as ordered, and God should be understood as being at the very center of all the different kinds of living things that there are that can be perceived. There is a celebration of order and a celebration of variety at one and the same time. All the time, keeping in mind that it's Spirit that makes this possible. The same Spirit which can be anywhere could also be at the beginning, before there was any real sense of a location. Genesis also picks up a theme which we've already seen within Psalm 104, namely that there is a particular affinity between God's Spirit and the reality of human life in particular. Because as Genesis relates the various days of creation, it comes to the moment when people emerge, and says in Genesis 1:27, "So God created the human in his image. In the image of God created them, male and female created them." That is, Genesis insists that as the triumph of making form out of what had been formless, God gives his own image to part of his creation, to human beings who can participate in his creativity in a way that is distinctive to them, and in a way also that includes male and female. There is, in other words, and this is another insight of faith, a particular connection between God's Spirit and the human spirit. Those who composed the book of Genesis in this section were particularly priestly writers. They especially come to voice in the book called Leviticus, a book which will give you more detailed information about the worship of ancient Israel within its temple than you will find elsewhere. But within it also, you will find a principle which was obviously very dear to Jesus and actually forms the basis of ethics in the inheritance of Jesus. The prophets had already insisted that one Israelite should not do harm to another Israelite. We saw this last time, especially in the book of Zechariah. But the book of Leviticus puts this matter more forcefully and much more positively while discussing the way in which Israelites should settle their disputes by going to a judge rather than by engaging in a cycle of vengeance with one another. Leviticus chapter 19 insists that courts exist for that very purpose, to make peace in Israel, and it also instructs what should be done after a case has been settled by a judge. Leviticus 19:18 states, "You shall not avenge." That is, once the case is over, it is over. You shall not avenge or hold resentment against your people. You're not to make this a constantly running dispute through the community. purpose of a law court is to settle the matter definitively. You are to put it behind you, whatever the result, win or lose. Do not hold resentment against your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh. Now, the priestly writer can say these words because the priestly writer knows very well that the Spirit of God is available to one's neighbor as well as to oneself. That affinity stands, so that we owe one another exactly the kind of regard that we show to ourselves. Paul, as well as Jesus, was especially struck by this principle, as we can see in our final entry, which comes from the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 2, verse 10. Paul, we should bear in mind, himself very frequently cites prophetic books, not only because he is trying to win a case, often he's trying to do that, but also because he sees in the prophets his own lineage. He saw himself as someone who had a prophetic call at the time of his encounter with the risen Jesus. And he speaks of the way in which it's possible for the people he writes to continue to understand God and to deepen their faith on a regular basis. He sees this as possible because of what God does by means of Spirit in this passage. Paul says, God has revealed to us through the Spirit. That's the way we understand God. By this invisible presence that makes its force felt. God has revealed to us through the Spirit, for the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. Remarkable statement. And a statement which insists that the life of discipleship is a life in which we are constantly deepening our insight into the nature of God, into what God would have us do by way of action, of how God would have us relate to one another in the field of ethics. Faith is a matter of being attuned to God's Spirit and therefore of being willing constantly to learn more about the reality of God. Now, when God is disclosed in this way, the result is that there's a change in people. And for that reason, in our last session next week, we'll take up the issue of the insight of the Spirit as it applies to human transformation. Because one power of the Spirit is to make people new on a constant basis. I look forward to joining you again next week. And now that we're in phase 2 in New York State, I might even be able to get to the barber before I do that. In any case, please keep well, and I look forward to seeing you all in the flesh. Take care.